Thanks very much, David. I'm delighted to be here. The title of my presentation is JFK, the Motorcade, the Medical Evidence, and the Assassination, the significance of which will become apparent as we proceed. According to the official account published in the Warren Report, a lone gunman fired 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building, with 2 hits and 1 miss, which injured a distant bystander by the name of James Tague, who was observing from location number 6. Prior to this discovery of a shot that had missed, even the commission supposed all 3 had hit. The first hit JFK in the back, the second hit Governor John Connally in the back, and the third hit JFK in the head, killing him. You see the key buildings here toward the top right above Houston. Main Street, the motorcade came down Main Street, took a right on Houston, did a 110-degree turn onto Elm Street, and shots began to be fired while JFK was on Elm Street. Number 1 is the official location of where he suffered a fatal shot to the head. Number 2 is a location from which Abraham Zapruder was purportedly filming what has come to be known as the Zapruder film. Number 3 is the grassy knoll, a wooden fence. There was a parking lot there that was used by the Dallas Police Department, and other locations here, 4, 5, 6 is where Tague was standing. I'll mention as we proceed. Notice the county records building, the Dow Techs in the background, and the book depository, especially the 6th floor window. Now, it would turn out that I had a casual interest from the time of the assassination until early 1992, when I discovered that a fellow by the name of Robert Lundberg, who was the editor-in-chief of the Journal of the American Medical Association, held a press conference in which he was attacking everyone who had done serious work on the assassination. This was very troubling to me. I had a lot of editorial experience. It was clear to me he was abusing his position. And it suggested to me that perhaps if a person of this level of prominence in the medical scientific community were abusing his position, perhaps some of us with special background and ability ought to become involved. I followed letters to the editor that occurred in JAMA and was struck by one from this fellow, David W. Mantic, who's both a PhD in physics from Wisconsin and MD from Michigan. He's board certified in radiation oncology, which is the treatment of cancer using X-ray therapy, which makes him an expert in the interpretation of X-rays. David would enter the National Archives in late 1992, telling me he thought that he would discover evidence of a second shot to the head and also proof that the X-rays had been altered. He would discover both. We would be joined by Bob Livingston, a world authority on the human brain, who was also an expert on wound ballistics, having supervised an emergency medical hospital for Japanese prisoners of war and Okinawans during the Battle of Okinawa. He was the scientific director of 2 of the Institutes for National Health located across the street from Bethesda Naval Hospital, where the official autopsy of JFK was conducted. Charles Crenshaw was among the physicians in trauma room number 1 when JFK's moribund body was brought in. He was the last to observe the body when it was wrapped in sheets and placed in an elaborate bronze casket. He even closed the president's eyes. 2 days later, he was responsible for the treatment of his alleged assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald. Jack White was a leading photographic and film expert with whom I did a great deal of collaboration on JFK. He would contribute to all 3 of the books that have been mentioned. John P. Costello, another PhD, this time with a specialty in electromagnetism, the properties of light and of images of moving objects, who would undertake very detailed, meticulous scientific studies of the extant version of the whole movie, the Zapruder film, and establish that it had been massively edited, as I am going to explain. A very important principle for you to bear in mind is known as the requirement of total evidence. to wit that scientific reasoning must be based upon all of the available relevant evidence, that conclusions are only justified by true premises, that authentic evidence must be separated from inauthentic, fabricated, or fake evidence, and that we're dealing here with the most complex murder mystery in history. A great deal of thought was given to planning the cover-up in the assassination of JFK, where the books that I edited had the historic function of shattering the cover-up and exposing what had been done to the body and how the medical evidence had been altered to obscure the true causes of the death of our 35th president. When Malcolm killed up the acting press secretary, announced that JFK was dead, which occurred at 1:30 Central Time in Texas, he put a finger to his head and said it was a simple matter of a bullet right through the head, attributing that finding to Admiral George Berkeley, who was the president's personal physician. During a press conference at 3:15, Malcolm Perry, MD, on the right, who had performed a tracheostomy through a small wound in the president's throat, explained 3 times that the wound to his throat was a wound of entry. A transcript of this event would not be provided to the Warren Commission, but would be published in Assassination Science. Charles Crenshaw, MD, who was present during the efforts to revive JFK at Parkland, drew these diagrams of the appearance of the throat wound before and after the tracheostomy incision, which are consistent with Dr. Perry's description of it as a wound of entry. Notice on the left side, it was simply a small, clean puncture wound, very obviously a wound of entry. Notice on the right, it's simply been supplemented by a very clean, straight incision line for a tracheostomy performed by Malcolm Perry. These diagrams, by the way, were also included in Assassination Science, which may be one of the reasons why it's such an enormously valuable resource for serious study of the medical evidence. Notice the tremendous difference here in the appearance of the throat. Something happened between Parkland and the taking of this photograph where the throat wound appears to have been altered. It would turn out that James Humes, who was the Navy commander in charge of the autopsy, called Bob Livingston early in the evening to ask him what the wound would look like if it had been a blowout, an exit wound instead of an entry. Bob described the wound, and it appears that the wound was altered to conform to his description to make it appear to be a wound of exit rather than entry. Right at the base, you can see the partial circle there from the original wound. Jackie's testimony to the commission about JFK's head wound was deleted from publication on the ground of respecting her privacy. But when you read it, it's obvious that that was not the actual reason. I was trying to hold his hair on. From the front, there was nothing. I suppose there must have been, but from the back, you could see, you're trying to hold his hair on and his skull on. I could see a piece of his skull sort of wedge-shaped like that, and I remember that it was flesh-colored with little ridges at the top. As I shall explain, I believe Jackie is talking about the skull flap, which you will understand when I review the autopsy evidence. Notice here that JFK's eyes are open, notwithstanding the fact that Chuck Crenshaw had closed them when the body was loaded into the bronze ceremonial casket. Officially, only one shot hit the president in the back of his neck, passed through his neck without hitting any bony structures, and entered the back of Governor John Connally, inflicting multiple wounds. It shattered a rib, exited his chest, damaged his right wrist, and entered his left thigh. Since this trajectory is so implausible and the alleged missile virtually pristine, it has come to be known as the magic bullet. Now notice this diagram, which was done by a Navy artist based upon a description given by Commander Humes. He did not have access to the body. And you will notice, as I'm going to explain, there's a crucial anatomical feature of a human body missing from this diagram. Here's a depiction of the magic bullet trajectory in a very well-known book entitled Case Closed by a fellow named Gerald Posner, where according to him, the bullet hit further down. Notice, not so high up as the artist's rendition would have it. And it went in the, more or less, it would appear from this diagram, his upper back, rather than the back of the base of his neck, exited his throat, went into Governor Connolly. The problems here are immense. Notice in the upper right that the path of the bullet has to have deviated to make it come out right. There's a great deal of manipulation and falsification of the evidence in order to make this take place. Recall, I mentioned in the beginning that the Secret Service and the FBI initially concluded there'd been 3 shots with 3 hits. That Jack had been hit in the back, that Connolly had been hit in the back, and then Jack had been hit in the back of the head, killing him. But when it turned out that one shot had missed, struck a curb, and injured the distant bystander, James Tague, they had to subtract one of those 3 shots and accommodate all the wounds with the remaining bullets. Since they committed themselves to only 3 shots, that required ingenuity, which led to the concoction of the magic bullet. We happen to know, however, that the magic bullet hypothesis is not true. It's testable and indeed falsifiable. Here's the jacket JFK was wearing, which shows a hole about 5.5 inches below the collar, which contradicts the official location of the wound. If the bullet entered here, especially at a downward angle, it's difficult to imagine how it could have passed through his neck and exited at his throat. Here's the shirt he was wearing. A bullet hole in the shirt turns out also to be about 5.5 inches below the collar, too low to correspond to the official location at the base of the back of the neck. Neither the shirt nor the jacket were sent forward to Bethesda for the autopsy, a violation of autopsy protocol. They were simply left behind at Parkland Hospital. Here is a diagram of the body from the official autopsy conducted by James Hume, who was assisted by J. Thornton Boswell. Neither of them had ever performed an autopsy on a gunshot victim before, which is a striking anomaly in the case. The best forensic pathologists in the country were awaiting a phone call that never came. Boswell's diagram of the wound shows a wound to the back about 5.5 inches below the collar. It was verified by Admiral George Berkeley, the president's personal physician. So look at the back, go down below the head, and notice below the collar, there's a mark there on the back for a wound that's about 5.5 inches below the collar. And in the right-hand diagram, notice in the lower left, there's a signature of verification by Admiral George Berkeley, the president's personal physician. 2 FBI agents who witnessed the autopsy, James Siebert, one of 2 FBI agents who witnessed the autopsy, James Siebert, drew a diagram showing the relative location of the wounds. For the back wound is lower than the throat wound, making it most unlikely that they were connected by a shot that had been fired from above and behind. You see the back wound, which corresponds in their diagram from the side to about 5.5 inches below the collar. And the throat wound, of course, at the location that Charles Crenshaw drew. You also see below that they have a diagram of a wound to the back of the head, about which I will have much more to say. This is Admiral Berkeley's death certificate on JFK, which said he'd been struck in the head by 1 shot, and that a second wound occurred at the posterior back at about the level of the 3rd thoracic vertebrae. He added that the head wound involved evisceration of the right hemisphere of the brain. Translated informally, that means that JFK had half his brains blown out in Dealey Plaza. The 3rd thoracic vertebrae location specified by Admiral Berkeley corresponds to 5.5 inches below the collar to the right of the spinal column. On the right hand, you see an attempt made by apologists for the Warren Commission, who are trying to explain away the evidence that proves that what the commission was reporting is false by claiming that JFK's jacket had been bunched up. so that the hole in the jacket actually was higher than the entry wound in the body. However, Jack wore custom clothing, custom shirts, custom jackets, which tend not to bunch up. And that wouldn't explain why the diagrams of a wound show it at the same location as on the body itself, as we saw from J. Thornton Boswell's sketch of the body, and from Admiral Berkeley's location of the wound is at the level of the third thoracic vertebrae. You might try to explain away the wounds in the shirt and the jacket by bunching, which is improbable on its face. But when you consider that they align with the wounds reported in the body, it's completely untenable to insist that the jacket was bunched, and that caused a discrepancy in locating where he was hit in the back. Even the Warren Commission staff concluded that the back shot had been at that location, as this reenactment photograph displays. The large circular patch on the back of the stand-in's jacket represents the back wound, the smaller above it, the official entry wound to the head. So the physicians at Bethesda would conclude that he'd been hit twice, once in the back, and that, of course, is supposed to be the entry wound for the magic bullet, and then again in the head at a location in the vicinity of the external occipital protuberance, which is that bump on your head where you'd rest if you were reclining in a bathtub. This is my favorite photograph from the entire collection of JFK photographs and films. It shows Arlen Specter, then a junior counsel of the Warren Commission, using a pointer to exhibit the path the magic bullet would have had to have taken in order to account for all of the wounds with only 2 shots. Since the larger circular patch visible below his left hand indicates the back shot, a photograph that's intended to illustrate the theory actually refutes it. In other words, look at his hand on the pointer. Notice it's higher up, much higher up than the round patch on the back of the head, so that a photograph that's intended to illustrate the magic bullet theory actually shows that it's unsustainable. You may notice here they use a Secret Service Cadillac for the reenactment, which is very peculiar. JFK, as virtually everyone but the Warren Commission staff appears to have known, was riding in a Lincoln limousine, not in the Cadillac. But by using the Cadillac for the reenactment, it vitiated, undermined, nullified the legal significance of the reenactment, because it was using a different vehicle, different height from the ground, different arrangement of seats and their distances and so forth, all of which, of course, had to have been deliberate. An astute student of JFK by the name of Roy Schaefer noticed that there's an apparent hole in the back seat at the top, which is bracketed in the red and in the white, so that the bullet that hit JFK in the back even appears to have passed through the upholstery of the limousine en route to striking him at that location 5.5 inches below the collar. It turns out that in the wake of the resurgence of interest generated by Oliver Stone's film JFK, the Congress passed the JFK Records Act that created a 5-person civilian panel known as the Assassination Records Review Board. And among the very first documents that the Assassination Records Review Board released to the public showed that Gerald Ford, Republican from Michigan, who was then a member of the commission, had had the back wound redescribed from his uppermost back, which is already an exaggeration, to the base of the back of his neck in an effort to make the magic bullet hypothesis appear more plausible. This particular copy of the article reporting that news appeared in the New York Times on the 3rd of July, 1997. In time for me to include it in Assassination Science, which was published in 1998. David Vanek, who, as I mentioned, is board certified in radiation oncology, took a CAT scan of a patient with chest and neck dimensions similar to those of JFK. When he plotted the official trajectory, it turned out to be anatomically impossible because cervical vertebrae intervene. Here you see the official entry location at the lower right, location of back wound at neck level, to the official exit point at the level of the throat. And notice all that white stuff in the middle, that's cervical vertebrae. And if you were to go back to that artist's rendition of the magic bullet theory, you'd realize that the feature that is missing from his sketch of JFK is the backbone. In other words, he drew a CAT scan where the figure had no spine and therefore no cervical vertebrae, which could have impeded the path of the bullet. But as David was able to demonstrate, it's an anatomically impossible trajectory. One of the most important ways we have of determining whether a story is true or is false involves whether it entails any violations of the laws of physics, engineering, aerodynamics, or in this case, of human anatomy and physiology. This account does, and therefore it cannot possibly be true, because these laws of nature cannot be violated and cannot be changed. David went into the National Archives, as I mentioned, and he discovered that there'd been alteration to the x-rays. Here's another set of diagrams provided by Dr. Crenshaw, who drew the massive blowout to the back of the head, which he described as the size of a baseball or of your fist when you double it up. If you just take your fist and put it to the back of your head, you would begin to appreciate the dimensions of the wound. Notice he has both a back view shown here on the right and a side view on the left. During an interview broadcast on television, he also described an entry wound at the right temple, which is consistent with the mortician's description. The House Select Committee on Assassinations, HSCA, reinvestigated the case in 1977-78. Its medical panel concluded that the entry wound was actually 4 inches above the entry locations previously specified by the Bethesda pathologist. It was depicted in diagrams right, but not visible in photographs left. In other words, look inside the circle on the right hand, which is a diagram by a woman by the name of Ida Dawkes, and you can see what the HSC purported to be the entry wound at the back of the head. On the left, however, you see a photograph, and when you look in the same area, there is no evident entry wound at the top of the head. Now, the Bethesda physicians had maintained that the wound was much lower and slightly to the left, 4 inches lower and slightly to the left of the location shown here. Now, if you look just above JFK's ear, you'll see what I refer to as the skull flap. Jackie described it as pink and as having serrated edges. This appears to have occurred when JFK was hit in the right temple by a frangible or exploding bullet that set up shock waves that blew his brains out the back of his already weakened cranium with such force that when they impacted with motorcycle patrolman Bobby Hargis riding there, he initially thought he himself had been shot. Notice, however, therefore, that the HSCA has here photographs and diagrams of the back of the head showing the back of the head completely intact. Where is that massive blowout observed at Parkland that was the size of your fist when you double it up? They covered it up. Indeed, a very important piece of evidence is a skull fragment shown at the upper left, which was picked up by a medical student by the name of Billy Harper on Saturday afternoon, 23 November 1963, in the grass opposite the grassy knoll. He took it to his uncle, Jack Harper, MD, on the staff at Methodist Hospital, who shared it with the chief pathologist, A.B. Carnes. He and 3 others identified it as occipital bone from the back of a human cranium. They took photographs of this piece of bone, which is known as the Harper fragment, before turning it over to the FBI, which is a good thing because, like other evidence in this case, it was misplaced. David W. Mandick, MD, PhD, has identified the location on the back of the president's skull from which it was blown out as murder in Dealey Plaza 2000 has explained. Not all of the evidence in this case was altered, fabricated, or otherwise faked. Some of it was simply lost. Now notice that location for the Harper fragment at the back of the head in the diagram on the upper right. What it means is those diagrams from the HSCA lower left cannot even accommodate the missing Harper fragment and therefore are obvious fabrications. This is extremely embarrassing because this was done by the House Select Committee on Assassinations that was impaneled in 1977-78 to reinvestigate the case, and as well as the death of Martin Luther King. But clearly, since their photographs and diagrams cannot even accommodate the Harper fragment, they're unbelievable. They are obvious fabrications. Above is an interesting pair of photographs that Robert Groden, who is widely regarded as a leading expert on the assassination, has produced. They show much longer hair. I mean, compare the top and the bottom. They show much longer hair on the subject, and it's all matted with gunk and gore. Indeed, when the HSCA deposed Commander Humes, a question was asked of them, proposed by David Mandick, as to whether the body had been given a shampoo and a haircut during the autopsy, because otherwise it's inexplicable how you could get from the top images to the bottom. The bottom are correct regarding length of hair, but what you're witnessing here are 4 fabricated photographs. All 4 of these are fake. Here's another diagram of the headroom by Robert McClellan, MD, who is also present at Parkland, depicting a massive blowout that fits Dr. Crenshaw's description. It was a terrible wound. So we have, from Dr. Crenshaw, we have the diagrams, the back wound and the side view, the size of your fist when you double it up. Another diagram, Robert McClellan, also present, showing a massive blowout. You can see the approximation to the size of your fist when you double it up. Here, nevertheless, is one of those Navy artist photographs where he wasn't allowed to see the body, but was told what to draw. And notice how this has the bullet on an upward trajectory coming out of the top of his head. According to the autopsy report from Bethesda, the fatal shot entered the back of his head and blew out the top of his skull. The Navy artist who was instructed to prepare these sketches was not allowed to observe the body and drew what he was told to draw. Even if it's very interesting how Clint Hill, whom most of you would be aware, rushed up from the Secret Service vehicle and pushed Jackie back down into her seat when she had climbed out on the back of the truck, where she was not trying to get away from a shooter, but going after a chunk of Jack's skull and brains that was lying there on the trunk, which she held in her hand all the way to the hospital. There's a question here of whether Clint touched Jackie, but they've been so massively edited, as I'll explain, that it appears to have been taken out. He's maintained for 47 years that he did. Here's a part of his report dated 30 November 1963 about the events of 22 November, a copy of which is archived. He reports, "As I lay over the top of the back seat, I noticed a portion of the president's head on the right rear side was missing, and he was bleeding profusely. Part of his brain was gone. I saw a part of his skull with hair on it," which is consistent with a frame of the Zapruder film I'm going to show, but not with earlier frames. Indeed, since this record was Warren Commission Exhibit CE, Commission Exhibit 1024, at least some of its members and staff had to have been aware of the observations of the first person to observe the head wound apart from Jackie herself. But even the Kennedy Detail, a book published in 2010 about the role of the Secret Service in Dallas, includes this stunning sentence: "And slumped across the seat, President Kennedy lay unmoving, a bloody, gaping, fist-sized hole, clearly visible in the back of his head, which you can find on page 217. An observation of enormous significance in relation to the autopsy photographs and x-rays, as well as to the authenticity of the Zapruder film. Here are some of the witnesses from Dealey Plaza, from Parkland Hospital, and even from Bethesda. Some 40 as to where the location of that wound occurred. Some 40 witnesses from Dealey Plaza, from Parkland, and from Bethesda, including bystanders, physicians, medical technicians, and agents of the FBI, reported that JFK had a massive blowout to the back of his head, the location of which they demonstrated with their hands. Now, just notice the consistency with which they locate that wound at the same approximate location drawn by Doctors McClellan and Crenshaw, and observed by Clint Hill, among others. Clint Hill's testimony is especially important because he was the first party not actually in the limousine, other than Jackie Kennedy herself, to observe that wound up close and personal. When David Mandic undertook his study of the x-rays, he was very suspicious that something was wrong. Notice on the left the extraordinary contrast between light and dark. Ordinarily, it's a relatively modest degree of contrast between the light and the dark portions of the x-rays. But David noticed that in the case of this JFK x-ray, this is the lateral cranial x-ray, in other words, taken from the side, in this instance from the right side, had much too much contrast, on the order of 500 times the amount of contrast between light and dark as you would observe in an ordinary authentic x-ray. The reports by all of those witnesses I've just shown you were discounted on the ground that the autopsy x-rays don't show it. Mantic, a PhD in physics, used a simple technique of optical densitometry to prove that an area identified here as area P had been patched using material far too dense to be human bone. Optical densitometry measures the amount of light that passes through an object such as an x-ray to determine the relative density of the objects whose exposure to radiation created the image. The thicker the object, the more radiation it absorbs, the less is transmitted to the photographic plate. So that if it's a very dense object, the area will be very light. If it's a very thin object, the area will be very dark. What David discovered, and he had to make hundreds of measurements, like a cubic centimeter by cubic centimeter, which was facilitated by the fact that he was extremely myopic at the time, in order to identify this area P for patch, which you see on the right. Now, if you look at the Zapruder frames, you find the early frames around the blowout at frame 313, 14, 15, 16, 17, that the back of the president's head has been blacked out and you cannot see the blowout. It occurred to me, however, that those who were altering the film might have been so fixated on the early frames that they overlooked that it might be visible in later frames. And in frame 374, I discovered what I was looking for, because you can actually see the blowout. Here's a close-up of that area. Notice the pink part. That's that skull flap that was extending out. Remember, Jackie described it as pink and having those serrated edges? But look behind the pink to the left there, sloping downward, that's gray matter. How often we hear brains described as gray matter. It was my suspicion that those who were involved in reconstructing home movies of the assassination, including the Zapruder film, might have overlooked frames past 313 through 316 that display the wound at the back of the head. I found this image of the blowout in frame 374. So here's a 317. Notice where you should see the blowout at the back of JFK's head, it is not visible. And it's similarly painted out in many other frames. In fact, a group of Hollywood film restoration experts have observed that the painting out of the wound was very crudely done. They couldn't believe how crudely it had been done. Now here's a comparison where you see on the left where it's been painted over and where you cannot see the blowout versus frame 374 on the right where you can see the blowout. Now we had physician after physician at Parkland Hospital who were experienced with gunshot wounds who observed both cerebral and cerebellar tissue extruding from the massive blowout to the back of the head. These observations were inconsistent with a blowout to the top of the head that blew his brains to the right front, which therefore also impeached the Zapruder film. In other words, if that last artist's depiction had been correct and the blowout had occurred at the top of the head, then you would not have extruding cerebellum, because that's a small compact part of the brain at the base, at the back of the brain, well below the area that that diagram describes. And yet we had physician after physician describing extruding cerebellum, Dr. Crenshaw, Dr. Jenkins, Dr. Carrico, Dr. Perry, Dr. McClellan, Dr. Baxter, Dr. Kemp Clark, who was a director of neurosurgery. And here is a diagram showing that location of the cerebellum on the left. Notice that compact part of the brain at the lower left. Now, this is a diagram taken from the brilliant book by David Lifton, Best Evidence, published initially in 1980. The cerebellum is situated at the base of the skull. The cerebellum is the cerebrum is a larger mass that comprises the upper portions of the brain. Blown out tissues of these kind would look very different in their appearance. Even first-year medical students would not confuse them. And notice too, you see on the right-hand side, we have the different locations of the sections of the skull that are characteristically identified in terms of, for example, occipital bone. Notice there's the external occipital protuberance toward the lower left of the occipital bone, where the Bethesda physicians maintained that a bullet had entered, but where the HSCA moved that location 4 inches upward to the crown of the head, whereas I have observed, you can see it in diagrams where it could be painted in, but not in the photographs, which do not show it. Now, Bob Livingston, Robert B. Livingston, MD, a world authority on the human brain and an expert on wound ballistics, studied reports of cerebral and cerebellar damage from Parkland. He concluded that the brain in diagrams and photographs at the National Archives cannot be that of JFK. Now, he's referring to the diagrams at the top there, which show a virtually complete and intact brain. Here's what he writes about it in an article published in Assassination Science. It simply cannot be true that the cerebellum could have been seen extruding from the occipital parietal wound by several experienced and thoroughly competent physicians, and for the same brain to be seen in superior and lateral photographs and depicted in a drawing, superior view, showing the cerebellum as being apparently intact. A conclusion is obligatorily forced that the photographs and drawings of the brain in the National Archives are those of some brain other than that of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Now, I might have drawn that inference based upon the reports from the physicians at Parkland Hospital. How much better that it should be drawn by a world authority on the human brain, who is also an expert on wound ballistics. Now, David also discovered a distribution of particles in the skull X-ray that is indicative of a second shot to the head. In other words, you know, we had that claim by the Bethesda physicians, which incidentally appears to be true, that JFK was hit in the back of the head in the vicinity of the external occipital protuberance. That would have been at the lower left in the diagram on the right. But David discovered a mass of metallic particles that were indicative of the use of a frangible or exploding bullet that entered in the vicinity of the right temple and were distributed in the brain in accordance with the laws of physics. So when David told me before entering the National Archives for the first time back in 1992 that he believed he would find evidence of a second shot to the head, but also proof that the official autopsy x-rays had been altered, He was correct on both counts. The mortician who prepared the body for burial told an investigator that in addition to the large gaping hole in the back of the head, there was a small wound in the right temple and a wound on the back 5 to 6 inches below the shoulder to the right of the spinal column. So there at the bottom we have that back wound. I'll go through the description. The physician's name was Thomas Evan Robinson. He gave this report by phone to an independent investigator in Texas on May 26, 1992. Wounds: large gaping hole in back of head, patched by stretching piece of rubber over it. Thinks the skull was full of plaster of Paris. Smaller wound in right temple, crescent shape, flap down 3 inches. That second part, crescent shape, flap down, is the skull flap, which is to be distinguished from the smaller wound in the right temple. Approximately 2 small shrapnel wounds in the face, which were packed with wax. This is a fascinating aspect of the case because the shot that hit JFK in the throat was fired from the front and passed through the windshield, where David Mandic believes, and I concur, that these small wounds in the face were caused by tiny shards of glass that hit JFK in the face as the bullet trajected the windshield to strike him in the throat. Wound in back 5 to 6 inches below shoulder to the right of the backbone. Adrenal gland and brain removed. Other organs removed and then put back. No swelling or discoloration to the face. Died instantly. That's very significant. It means because JFK, having had half his brains blown out in Dealey Plaza, he died instantly. And I'll explain the sequence of shots that appears to have brought this result about. So we have this extraordinarily anomalous result. We have at Parkland the size of your fist when it's doubled it up. In Bethesda, believe it or not, according to the official autopsy report, which I published in Assassination Science 1998, the wound was enormous, extended far above that fist-sized blowout, well up into the upper cranium. It turns out when the Assassination Records Review Board deposed the various physicians, when they got to Thomas Evan Robinson and showed him a diagram that Boswell had made of the skull that had dotted lines for a much larger apparent wound, the mortician who spent more time with the body than anyone else explained, oh no, the doctors did that because Commander Humes, believe it or not, actually took a cranial saw to the skull of JFK and enlarged the wound to make it appear something more like the effect of a shot from behind, which is, of course, what you have in that artist's rendering. Remember, it was he who dictated to the artist what to draw to make it look more like the effect of a shot caused from behind. But that, of course, would not have yielded the extruding cerebellar as well as cerebral tissues. And then look at the right. It's as though the HSCA wanted to redo the cover-up from the beginning and do it right. So they moved the wound reported by the Bethesda physicians at the vicinity of the external occipital protuberance upward and claimed, which you can see here in the diagram, but not in the photograph, that he'd been hit in the crown of the head. So according to the HSCA, he was hit in the back of the neck by the magic bullet, which has an anatomically impossible trajectory. And then contrary to all the Bethesda report, that he was hit in the very top of the head. And notice that, you know, that massive blowout at the back of the head is simply not there. They covered it up literally. I'm really shocked and embarrassed to have to tell you that this was our own American government performing this act of deception on the American people. But we have to place truth ahead of all other considerations, and the evidence that this is what happened is simply overwhelming. What that means is JFK appears to have been hit 4 times. Once in the throat from in front. That's from the TUP south. That means a triple underpass where 3 different roadways came together there. That shot appears to have been fired from inside the triple underpass through the windshield to strike JFK in the throat. The wound that Dr. Crenshaw diagrammed of a small point of entry, which Malcolm Perry described 3 different times during the Parkland press conference, the transcript of which was not provided to the Warren Commission as a wound of entry. Once in the back from behind, that's a shot we see the holes for in the shirt, in the jacket, where the wound, corresponding wound on the body, is on the autopsy sheet prepared by Boswell, corresponding to the FBI report about the relative location of the wounds in the back and in the throat. The shots to the throat and his right temple appear to have been fired from above ground sewer openings on the south and north sides of the triple underpass. Well, we have done further research, gone back to Dealey Plaza, and discovered that the shot to the throat, which initially appeared to be from the south side of the triple underpass, actually was fired from within the triple underpass, not far from where James Tague was located, ironically, but where the shot to the right temple was fired from the intersection of the picket fence and the triple underpass, where there was an above-ground sewer opening. It was an ideal shooting location. The evidence about the superservice involvement in the case is really profoundly disturbing. 2 Secret Service agents who would have accompanied the limousine were left behind at Love Field by Emery Roberts, the agent in charge of the Presidential Protective Detail. Here, one of them, Henry Ribka, expresses dismay at being called off. 2 agents. The other one you can barely see at the left of this particular frame. These men would have run along beside the presidential limousine or ridden on the back, but they were called off at Love Field. The motorcycle escort was reduced to 4 who were instructed not to ride forward of the rear wheels of the presidential limousine. One of them observed that it was the damnedest formation he'd ever seen. JFK's military aide, who normally sat between the driver and the agent in charge, was moved to the last vehicle along with the president's personal physician. Observed that he ordinarily would have sat in between William Greer, the driver, number 1, and the agent in charge, Roy Kellerman, number 2, right in between, which means that if the president's military aide had been left in his normal location, he would have been hit by the bullet that passed through the windshield en route to hitting JFK in the throat. So it was indispensable to move him, to get him out of the way, which of course is very extraordinary, not to mention moving the president's personal physician to the last limousine, because that meant he was in the worst possible position to provide emergency medical attention should it be necessary. And of course, his military aide carries all the instructions for a retaliatory strike should the United States be hit. So all this happening was really quite extraordinary. Notice in the limousine, we have Nellie Conley in the jump seat number 3 and John Conley in the jump seat number 4, and then Jackie number 5 and JFK number 6. When you look at the motorcycle patrol officers, James Chaney was the first, number 9, and Douglas Jackson, number 10 on the outside. And on the other side, Officer 7 was Billy Joe Martin, and number 8 was Officer Robert Weldon Hargis, where Bobby Hargis, as I have mentioned, was struck so hard by the debris that was blown out of JFK's head to the left rear that would have impacted him. He initially thought he himself had been shot. There's a long-standing story that William Greer turned and shot JFK. It appears to have originated from William Cooper, who had a very bad copy of the Zapruder film, but where it appeared to Cooper that William Greer extended his hand, his left hand actually, with a silver-plated .45 and shot JFK in the head. I would observe that if Greer had shot JFK, then his brains would have been blown out to the right rear. But instead, they were blown out to the left, which means that the theory that Greer shot JFK, for which there is some reason, in support, some evidence, cannot be sustained on the basis of the ballistic evidence, because the trajectory of the debris, the exit of the brains from the head, would have been completely different. And there, of course, you have the Secret Service limousine, special agent driver Sam Kinney, Emery, number 11, Emery Roberts, number 12. Kenny O'Donnell and Dave Powers were in that vehicle. There was an agent on the right by the name of John Reddy. It's quite shocking, however, but during the shooting in Dealey Plaza, when Reddy began to respond to rush forward, Emery Roberts called him back. So just as Emery Roberts left two agents behind at Love Field, he called back John Reddy, who was responding. Subsequently, Clint Hill, on the left-hand side, would rush forward, of course, climb on the back of the trunk and push Jackie down, lay across their bodies, and observe that fist-sized blowout to the back of the head up close and personal. Now, there are more than 15 indications of Secret Service complicity in setting JFK up for the hit. In addition to the agents being left behind at Love Field, the manhole covers were not welded shut. Open windows were not covered. The crowd was allowed to spill into the street. Notice here, the crowd. There was a 112th Military Intelligence Unit should have been distributed throughout the city for the sake of crowd control, to keep the spectators back. But they were ordered to stand down over the adamant opposition of their commanding officer. Here's a stunning, absolutely stunning photograph of the motorcade, where the president is even passing by a bus. I mean, just imagine there'd been an assassin in the bus with a handgun. He could have shot JFK with no effort at all from a range of 15 feet. And look at that crowd spilling out into the street. It's wonderful to have the enthusiastic reception he received in Dallas. But this is simply outrageous that the presidential protection for the President of the United States was virtually non-existent in Dallas. The motorcade route was also changed 4 days before. Governor Connolly was instrumental in making a change to the motorcade route on November 18th, 1963, 4 days before the event. Normally, a motorcade route, once fixed, is never changed, so the Secret Service can check every building and screen its occupants. This change brought the president past the Texas School Book Depository building. Otherwise, the motorcade could have proceeded forward on Main Street and got onto the Stemmons Freeway to head off to the location where JFK would be delivering his lunchtime address. Instead, it was blocked off. Main Street was blocked off, and the motorcade was forced to take a right onto Houston, a 110-degree turn back onto Elm Street, which was another violation of Secret Service protocol, since you're never supposed to take a turn of more than 90 degrees. I believe the purpose was to slow down the limousine without alarming the occupants. So by arranging this turn, which William Greer misnavigated, he swung out too widely and nearly hit a concrete abutment there. Apparently mistaken that little road, you see that little extension in front of the Texas School Book Depository? He thought he was turning there instead of onto Elm Street, so he wound up swinging out too far. Or Roy Truly, for example, observed that he nearly hit a concrete abutment and had to move to get the limousine back in line to proceed forward. In my opinion, this may be the most damning evidence of all. Most tellingly, the vehicles were in an improper sequence. The presidential limousine was placed first. Lower-ranking dignitaries such as the mayor and the vice president should have preceded him. Reporters were moved to the rear, and the president's personal physician to the last car. which put him in the worst location should the patient require emergency medical treatment. They had to get the presidential limousine out front so it would be very obvious to the shooters in their various locations where he was located. Typically, a presidential motorcade consists of a string of uniformly black Cadillac limousines. In this case, however, they were of all different makes, models, and colors, so that the conspirators could know who was located where, simply looking by the make and color of the presidential limousine. So as I've observed, the president's vehicle should have been in the middle. It should have been preceded by a flatbed truck where the reporters with their cameras could film this event, which was a major political occurrence that ought to have got a lot of publicity. Instead, they canceled the flatbed truck. They moved the reporters to the back. Notice toward the bottom, you see here, camera car 1, camera car 2, camera car 3. Well, what are photographers going to be able to photograph when they're in that relative location? It's obvious that was done quite deliberately to ensure they would not have a lot of photographs taken of what actually would take place after the limousine turned from Houston on to Elm. At Parkland Hospital, where the moribund president was taken, a Secret Service agent took a bucket and sponge and began cleaning up the blood and brains from the limousine. When onlookers noticed a through and through hole in the windshield, the vehicle was moved. Look there, you have the bucket on the ground, and you'll see an agent leaning in to wash out the blood and brains. Now, bear in mind, this was a crime scene on wheels. So what was taking place here was that a Secret Service agent was altering the evidence, obfuscating the evidence, destroying the evidence. The net result, however, would be even more severe, because the limousine would be sent back to Ford Motor Company and ordered to be torn down to bare metal. The windshield would be replaced. The upholstery would be replaced. All the blood and so forth would be destroyed. This was an extraordinary event that required the authority at the highest level of the American government. It had to have been directed by either Lyndon Johnson, the President of the United States, or J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI. Now, interestingly, a friend of Sam Kinney, who was the driver of the Secret Service vehicle, the Cadillac, which they affectionately referred to as Queen Mary, contacted me to say that he had been told by Sam, who was his neighbor in Florida, that he was the person who got the bucket of sponge and washed the blood and brains out of the limousine, because he didn't want the vehicle to be seen in that condition. That's a bit of a difficult claim to have made. I'm willing to believe it was Sam Kinney who did this. Kinney also claimed to have found a whole intact bullet in the back seat that he took inside and left on a stretcher. Well, that's not impossible either, because the magic bullet was a virtually completely intact shell from a Mannlicher Carcano. It had slight longitudinal distortion, but it wasn't banged up. It didn't have a mushroom head. They took test bullets from a Mannlicher Carcano and fired them into a corpse, just say into the wrist of a corpse, and they found it emerged with a mushroom. It was severely distorted. But the magic bullet, which the government claimed had performed all those feats of entering at the base of the back of the neck, traversing the neck without hitting any bony structures, exiting the throat, going into the back of John Connolly, shattering a rib, exiting his chest, hitting his right wrist, winding up in his left thigh, was a virtually completely intact bullet. In fact, Dr. Robert Shaw, who looked after John Connolly, explained he thought it was highly unlikely that that bullet had caused all the damage, because he had removed more lead from John Connolly's right wrist than was missing from that bullet. So it's clear we have here another element of an elaborate charade. There was no magic bullet. And while Kinney may have found the bullet in the back seat, moreover, because that shot to the back of JFK's back that entered 5.5 inches below the collar, only entered about as deep as a second knuckle on your little finger and had no point of exit. It was not recovered in the hospital during the treatment of JFK. It was not recovered at Bethesda. So it is entirely possible that that bullet, which was a virtually complete intact bullet, was found by Sam Kenney and placed on a stretcher. Most students of JFK, however, believe it's more likely that Jack Ruby actually planted that, where we have, Jack Ruby playing a rather ubiquitous role in Dallas in relation to all of these events. Here's the bullet hole in the windshield. By Monday, November 25th, 1963, the day of the formal state funeral, the vehicle had been sent back to Ford to be completely stripped down to bare metal and rebuilt, including replacing the windshield, which had a bullet hole, the black spot in the center of the small white spiral nebula close to the right center, facing the vehicle from the front. The Secret Service would produce yet a third different windshield with cracks in its place to misrepresent the original damage. Now look on the left where I have a pointer to that small white spiral nebula with a dark hole in the center. It's where JFK's left ear would be visible if you could see it. Jack has already been hit in the throat. He's clutching his throat. Jackie has her hand on his sleeve from this shot that passed through the windshield. Now, a brilliant study about the Lincoln limousine was authored by Douglas Weldon and can be found in Murder in Dealey Plaza, published in 2000, where Doug Weldon even managed to track down the official at Ford Motor Company who had been responsible for replacing the windshield and who confirmed to him that it had a through-and-through bullet hole from front to rear in the windshield, but which they had been under instructions destroyed. So they put in a clean windshield. Therefore, the windshield on the right, which has a series of spider hole cracks that appear to have been caused by fragments of a bullet striking it from the inside, from behind, was a replacement by the Secret Service. We have a tremendous amount of research on all of these subjects. For example, a fellow by the name of Jim Lewis has been traveling through the South firing high-powered rifles through the windshields of junked automobiles to see if he could hit a dummy in the back seat. He's not only been able to hit a dummy in the back seat, but that he has discovered that the windshield winds up with a small white spiral nebula with a dark hole in the center, as we find in the famous Alchin's photograph shown on the left, and very importantly, that it makes a sound of a firecracker when it passed through, because many of the witnesses in Dealey Plaza reported hearing a first shot that sounded different than the others. It sounded like a firecracker. What they were hearing appears to have been that shot to the throat that passed through the windshield. By the way, all of the weapons save one were silenced weapons. Only one weapon, a Mannlicher Carcano, that was used to fire 3 shots from the Dow Tex, from the broom closet window of a uranium mining company that was an asset of the CIA, was unsilenced. And it was such an unreliable weapon that it scored 2 misses, but 1 hit. One of the misses hit that distant curbing and injured James Tague. Another miss hit the chrome strip above the windshield on the inside, and the third hit JFK in the back of the head. Here you can also see that hole in the windshield in frame 225 of the Zapruder film, which means those who want to deny that there was a hole in the windshield but also insist that the Zapruder film is authentic are adopting an incoherent position, because even the Zapruder film shows that hole through the windshield in its frame 225. Now, John P. Costella, that PhD in electromagnetism, has collated eyewitness reports about the assassination, which includes dozens and dozens about the limo stop. Some reported seeing it slow dramatically, others that it came to a complete stop, which makes sense since from different positions, different witnesses would have seen it slow dramatically as it came to a complete stop. Among them is Tony Foster, who was interviewed by Deborah Conway in 2000. As Daniel Gallup has observed, Foster seems to have no idea that her recollections contradict the official record. Tony told Deborah, for some reason the car stopped. It did stop for seconds. I don't even know why it stopped, and all of a sudden it sped up and they went under the underpass. I could never figure out why the car stopped. The way she delivers these lines, Gallup observed, I doubt Tony had ever seen the Extant Z film and had no idea her recollections contradicted that film. He said he was reminded of David Lifton's early 1971 interviews with the Newmans, who were on the grassy knoll, by the way, who also said the limo had stopped. They had no way of knowing at the time that the Z film showed no such stop. All of this is to say the earliest recollections of individuals are likely to be the most significant, he added, especially if there is evidence of a lack of exposure to contrary viewpoints that might influence memory. For a few more, Billy Lovelady, who is on the steps of the Texas School Book Depository on 19 March 1964. I recall that following the shooting, I ran toward the spot where President Kennedy's car had stopped. Roy Truly on the north end of Elm Street in front of the building, who was Oswald's supervisor, 24 March 1964. The car. I saw the president's car swerve to the left and stop somewhere down in this area. Later, during his testimony before the commissioner, Mr. Bellin, when you saw the president's car seem to stop, how long did it appear to stop? Mr. Truly, it would be hard to say, over a second or two, something like that. I didn't see. I just saw it stop. I don't know. I didn't see it start up. Mrs. Earl Cabell, this is the wife of the mayor of Dallas, 4 cars behind the presidential limousine at the top of Elm Street at the time of the shots on 13 July 1964. I was aware the motorcade stopped dead still. There was no question about that. Later, as I told you, the motorcade was stopped. Later, in response to Mr. Hubert asked, that was when your car at least had come to a standstill? Mrs. Campbell, every car in the motorcade had come to a standstill. Later, we were dead still for a matter of some seconds. That's in their actual Warren Commission testimony, which of course is included in the supporting volumes and exhibits. So that you have the anomaly of an 881-page Warren Commission report, a summary of the findings and investigation, where the conclusions presented in the summary report are contradicted by the exhibits and testimony reported in the so-called supporting volumes. Noel Twyman published a completely brilliant book entitled Bloody Treason. If you're ever able to obtain a copy of it, it's a masterpiece. He asked Roderick Ryan, who is an expert on special effects from Hollywood, when he was completing his book, why the background was blurred in frame 302, but not in frame 303. And Ryan explained that the camera was panning the limo in 302, but not in 303, where it was stationary. On page 159, he added that he had shown it to his son, who was also in the film industry, and that he agreed it was moving in 302, but standing still in 303. So look on the left. There you have frame 302. Notice the figures in the background. The immediate foreground, the limousine, is more or less in focus, but the background is not, because the camera was panning, moving with the limousine. But look at frame 303. Both the foreground and the background are in focus. That is an optical impossibility if the camera was moving following the limousine, which means both the limousine and, of course, the figures in the background were stationary at the time. Further proof, of course, that the limousine was brought to a halt. An associate of Abraham Zapruder, Erwin Schwartz, viewed the film in what may have been its original state at Eastman Kodak, where it was developed. Nearly 60 witnesses have reported that the limousine slowed dramatically or came to a complete halt, as Vincent Palomara has explained in a chapter in Murder in Dealey Plaza 2000. When Noel asked him about the limo stop, he was vague and could not recall. But when Noel asked him about the effects of the fatal headshot, Schwartz was quite specific and very graphic. He said that he had seen Kennedy's head suddenly whip around to the left, and that he had seen an explosion of blood and brains from the head, and that it had been blown out to the left and rear. Twyman pressed him on this crucial point, but Swartz was emphatic. His account may be found in Bloody Treason. I report it here. I also asked him to describe what he saw at the instance of the fatal headshot. His answer was very descriptive. He said he saw Kennedy's head suddenly whip around to the left, counterclockwise. I also asked him if he saw the explosion of blood and brains out of the head. He replied that he did. I asked him if he noticed which direction the eruption went. He pointed back over his left shoulder. He said it went this way. I said, you mean it went to the left and rear? He said, yes. Bartholomew then asked him, are you sure that you didn't see the blood and brains going up and to the front? Swartz said, no, it was to the left and rear. We went over this point several times with him to be certain that he was clear on this point. He was very clear. The first frames from the Zapruder film to which the public had access were published in Life magazine. Most were unremarkable, but this one, frame 313, posed special problems. The plate was broken twice to revise description 6, which appears to be unique in the history of publishing. There are many indications this and other films have been edited, including the all but motionless spectators, the driver's head turns twice as fast as humanly possible, and the blob and blood spray, which appear to have been painted in. Blood and brains across the trunk and the drivers pulling to the left and bringing the vehicle to a halt had to be removed because it was such an obvious indication of Secret Service complicity in setting up JFK for the hit. Let me read number 6. This is the second revision of the text. The direction from which the shots came was established by this picture, taking that the instant bullet struck the rear of the president's head and passing through, caused the front part of his head to explode forward. Well, this is an altered image, and most of you would be aware that you need to have 2 points to establish a trajectory. This is basically showing an impact of a bullet with the skull, and in fact, because his motion is violently back and to the left, virtually everyone who has ever observed the Zapruder film would contradict the report here of Life magazine. Let me talk about the plate being broken twice to revise that description. Every copy of a magazine like Life magazine comes off one unique set of plates. So what they did here was actually break the plate on which this page appeared to revise the description, and they did it twice because they were particularly concerned to get it right as a form of covering up what in fact had happened to the 35th President of the United States. Here's another report. Further confirmation of the blowout to the left rear comes from Secret Service agents such as Sam Kinney and Vincent Gullo Jr. Vincent Palomara, who is the leading assassination expert on the Secret Service, wrote to Gullo to explain that Kinney had told him of his discovery of a piece of the right rear of the president's skull in the limousine during the flight back to Washington, D.C., and that another member of the detail had become nauseated from observing the blood and gore on the limousine trunk. Gullo confirmed Kinney's statements to Palomara, saying that he was totally familiar with the facts as Palomara outlined them. Here are his notes. Vincent J. Gullo Jr., letter to Vince Palomara. I wrote, Sam Kinney told me that, A, he found the piece of the right rear of President Kennedy's skull on the C-130, that's a cargo plane, while en route back to Andrews Air Force Base after the tragedy, and B, that one of you guys got sick from seeing the rear of the limousine with all the blood and gore. Do you remember any of these specific events? Gullo responded, I'm totally familiar with the facts as you outlined them. This was a benchmark in my life, and I've shared my thoughts on this incident with few individuals, mostly federal agents. I'm sure you can understand my reluctance to entertain your questions, given the sensitivity of the matter, even to this date. Emphasis added. He did not respond to his follow-up letter. The blood and brains on the trunk is particularly important because it's not visible in the Zapruder film. They cleaned the blood and brains off of the limousine in the Zapruder film to obfuscate the fact that JFK had been hit from the front. His brains had blown out the back. This is Clint Hill, who was giving a talk at a bookstore in San Diego about the Kennedy detail. And what is interesting about this, as John Costello observed, is that Clint reiterated here how he had rushed up to the back of the limousine, how he'd pushed Jackie Kennedy back down, how he'd laid across their bodies and had viewed this fist-sized hole in the back of JFK's brains. Clint Hill has been giving this consistent report for nearly 50 years now. He has been induced to claim that there were 3 shots fired, but it's quite obvious from his report that even if there had only been 3 shots fired, which turns out to be a gross abbreviation of what actually took place, the one he saw, the massive blowout to the back of the head, had been fired from in front. And therefore, if there were any shooters to the rear, there had to have been a conspiracy, since a conspiracy only requires 2 or more individuals cooperating together to bring about an illegal end. When you do a close-up comparison of other films, and there are about 8 altogether, the most important which are the Nix film and the Zapruder film, you find that there's a difference in how far Clint Hill goes forward in the Nix and in the Zapruder. In the Nix film, Jackie comes further back onto the trunk, and Clint Hill goes further forward up onto the trunk. In the right, you see what we find in the Zapruder. The Nix, of course, was taken from the opposite side of the grassy knoll. But the fact is that while they use the Zapruder as a guideline to edit the other films, it was done imperfectly. And indeed, if it weren't for that, we would not have been able to have the mountain of proof about the alteration of the films. If it were done today, for example, using digital technology, it could have been done virtually to perfection, and no anomalies like these would exist. One of the most fascinating aspects is the double hit theory. After the limousine was brought to a halt, Jack was hit in the back of the head by the shot I mentioned, fired by a Mannlicher Carcano from the Daltex building. His head moves forward from frame 312 to 313. And then from 313, 14, 15, it moves back with considerable violence. Now, in his book, 6 Seconds in Dallas, Josiah Thompson publishes a brilliant assessment of the double hit theory based upon measurements, very precise, of the head moving forward. Indeed, we have the head moving forward and then violently back to the left. As the 50th observant of the assassination grew closer, however, Josiah Thompson began disavowing the double hit theory, for example, published in his book in 1966, even though it is by far the most scientific and impressive of his work. Here you see the exact plots in relation to a fixed feature of the limousine, where you notice from 312 to 313, the body goes forward and then it goes back and to the left. Those of you who have observed the film will notice this was quite a violent back and to the left. David Mandick, who's done a great deal of research on the film and of course is the leading expert on the medical evidence, believes that was an artifact of the mode of alteration. We have reports from witnesses who have seen what appears to be the unedited film, that after the limousine stopped, Jack was hit in the back of the head, he slumped forward. Jackie eased him back up and was looking him right in the face when he was hit in the right temple by that frangible or exploding bullet that blew out his brains to the left rear with such force that when they impacted with Officer Hargis, he initially thought he himself had been shot. Jack then slumped to the left while Jackie climbed out on the trunk. They seem to have removed too many frames in eagerness to reduce the amount of exposure, but it was a blunder because it created this violent back and to the left that makes it unmistakable, creates the unmistakable impression of Jack having been hit from the front and being violently moved to the left and to the rear. Interestingly, although Josiah Thompson has sought to repudiate the double hit theory, David Lifton had gone to Caltech to consult with Richard Feynman, perhaps the most famous physicist and a Nobel Prize winner at the time, and he showed him photographs where Feynman independently conducted his own measurements and determined that the head had moved forward from 312 to 313 and then had moved violently back into the left. So we already had an independent confirmation from the world's leading physicist of the double hit theory. And that means what actually took place in Dealey Plaza actually looked a whole lot more like this. That the shot to the back was fired from the top of the county records building. That's a shot that hit JFK in the back. It appears to have been fired with a 30-06, a larger caliber weapon, to implant a Mannlicher Carcano bullet in the back of JFK using a small plastic collar known as a sabot. The shot to the throat, here the blue line from the lower left, this is inaccurate. It should be moved to the left and come from inside the triple underpass now based on additional research, which is one more illustration of the fact that when you are confronted with new alternative hypotheses and new evidence, you may have to reject hypotheses you previously accepted, accept hypotheses you previously rejected, and leave others in suspense. That bullet, of course, passed through the windshield and struck JFK in the throat. Then we have shots that were fired from the Dow Techs. Those are the yellow lines from the back, the broom closet to that uranium mining company that was an asset of the CIA. Those were the three shots, one of which goes all the way forward, notice, down to the left to hit the curbing and cause the injury to James Tague, a cut in his cheek, a second of which missed and hit the chrome strip over the limousine, the third of which, however, hit his target, hit JFK in the back of the head where he slumped forward. Jackie eased him back up and was looking him right in the face when he was hit by a frangible or exploding bullet when the limousine was considerably further down. Look at the shot there in purple coming from the intersection of the triple underpass and the picket fence. That's the shot that hit JFK in the right temple and exploded, causing the blowout of the skull flap and the brains blown out to the left rear. Look how much further down it is on Elm Street than the location that the government claims where JFK was hit. Additional shots were fired, for example, from the grassy knoll. A shot was fired by an officer in a Dallas police uniform, but it missed. It appears that he pulled the shot, even though it would have been among the easiest, perhaps even the easiest shot, because they were under strict instructions that Jackie should not be harmed. So he pulled his shot, and the slug was pulled out of the grass by a lieutenant later. Notice the orange lines. Those are from the book depository, where you'll notice in between the orange and the yellow lines, no shots were fired from the official assassin's lair. Instead, that was created as a location using the acoustical sound of the three shots that were fired by the unsilenced weapon at the Dow Techs to set up the acoustical impression of only three shots having been fired. Multiple shots, however, were fired at John Connolly from the opposite side of the building in the mistaken belief that the shooter was firing at Ralph Yarborough, a liberal Texas senator, where Lyndon had an enormous fight with JFK that morning trying to get John Connolly out, where Connolly had been Lyndon's campaign manager, and get Ralph Yarborough in, where Jack overrode him on the ground that the chief executive of the state should ride with the chief executive of the United States. What this means is when you have 4 hits in JFK, you have at least 3 misses, that one in the dirt, the one that missed and injured Tague, the one that hit the chrome strip, that's 7, and then 1 to 3 shots in Connolly. I suspect the higher number is more accurate. You have 8, 9, or 10 shots fired from a minimum of 6 different locations. To my relative astonishment, David Mandick now believes there may have been yet another shot that hit JFK in the head, about which he has published in a book of his now available on Amazon.com about the JFK skull x-rays, which a serious student will want to pursue. Let me say that all of this began with the Secret Service forcibly removing the body from Parkland Hospital. At the time, the only crime that had been committed was murder. There were no statutes or laws at the time against the assassination of even a president of the United States. The Secret Service forcibly removed the body from Parkland Hospital over the objections of the Justice of the Peace, Theron Ward, who informed them that it was a necessity that an inquest should be conducted in Dallas. Had an inquest been conducted in Dallas, they had a world-famous medical examiner by the name of Earl Rose, who actually conducted an autopsy on J.D. Tippit, Jefferson Davis Tippit, who was a police officer who would be shot ostensibly by Lee Oswald. But the shell casings that were found at the scene had been ejected from automatics. Oswald only had a revolver. The first officer on the scene initialed them. There were two of one make, Western, two of another, Remington Rand, suggesting there had been two shooters. Later, there was a substitution in the evidence, and now they were revolver shell casings that did not have the initials, where that appears to have been a fabricated event to blame Lee Oswald for the shooting. At this point in time, he appears to have already been in the Texas theater. The body was put into that bronze ceremonial casket, where, as I observed, Charles Crenshaw actually closed JFK's eyes when he was wrapped in sheets and put into this casket that was then loaded aboard Air Force One. The excuse was given that Jackie insisted on staying with the body. They didn't want to leave it in Dallas for a multiplicity of reasons. They wanted to get the body under military control. During the swearing in of Lyndon Johnson, which was completely unnecessary, but which LBJ claimed that Bobby Kennedy had insisted ought to be done, everyone came forward from the plane, and only one person was left to guard the casket at the back of the plane. David Lifton has theorized that the body was taken out of the casket at that point in time and placed into a body bag. There was a secret compartment in the plane, and it appears that the body was stored in that secret compartment, so that when they arrived at Andrews Air Force Base and all attention was focused on Jackie, and you can see Bobby standing beside her unloading the casket, that in fact on the other side of the plane, JFK's body was being offloaded in the body bag into a helicopter where it would be flown to Walter Reed Medical Hospital, where the best forensic pathologists in the military were situated in order to remove lead slugs, because the shooters were using different caliber bullets. It would not have done to maintain the official story of 3 shots from a Mannlicher Carcano had different slugs of different calibers from different weapons been uncovered. And it appears that they removed the slugs at Walter Reed Hospital, and then the body in a body bag was put into a pinkish gray shipping casket and taken in a black hearse to the back of Bethesda Naval Hospital, where it was offloaded into the morgue. Meanwhile, Jackie got into the gray Navy ambulance and was followed by an immense entourage all the way to Bethesda Naval Hospital.
Jim, we're down to about 3 minutes.
I'm virtually done. David Lifton, who undertook this research, was the first to sort out what had happened here with the body, the casket switch. Here you see the 3 books of mine, Assassination Science, Murder in Dealey Plaza, and The Great Zapruder Film Hoax, which I regard as sequels to his brilliant pioneering work, Best Evidence. Finally, and this is the last slide, the fact that the body was already at Bethesda in the morgue undergoing autopsy when the gray Navy ambulance and the massive entourage accompanying Jackie showed up has been confirmed to me directly by Gerald Custer, who is a radiation technician who actually took the x-rays. Gerald has told me how he was proceeding upstairs in the company of 2 Secret Service agents with autopsy x-rays in order for them to be developed when he looked out the window and saw the Navy ambulance and the massive entourage asking himself what in the world was going on, since the body was already in the morgue undergoing autopsy. I can't thank you enough for giving me this opportunity to review the medical evidence in the greatest murder mystery in history. Thank you, one and all.